I want to invite, we do have people asking questions on Slido. So again, it's sli.do. That's the website, and the code is talks. I will actually initiate the questions. I kept hearing all these different groups and movements, and I keep thinking you must meet resistance from some individuals or some groups where you go and talk to them and they're just not convinced, or maybe they say yes and then nothing happens. So in your own spheres, you have very different constituents here, but in your own spheres, are there groups specifically that you've seen over the years that are more resistant to maybe changing their practices? And then what's the best strategy to convince them to maybe not use endocrine disruption, and just endocrine disrupting chemicals, or actually do something about the chemicals that are currently in use?
Well, yeah, I'll go ahead and start. We definitely encounter resistance all the time. Not to paint with a broad brush, it typically tends to come from industry. However, I would say that industry is a spectrum, so we have really good actors like Beauty Counter who acknowledge that there's an issue and are very transparent about the steps that they're taking. But unfortunately, not all companies operate like Beauty Counter in admitting that there is a problem or recognizing that there is one, or think that status quo is completely satisfactory. And so I think it's going to be different tools and tactics for different segments of industry. So for some, being recognized positively for the things that they're doing is sufficient to motivate action. For others, it's going to be less carrot and more stick. And that means calling them out for not stepping up to the plate. Mm-hmm. And then for others, it's maybe not either one or the other of those carrot stick things, but for them to realize for themselves that there is some sort of market advantage for doing the right thing. And in those cases, I think part of the work that we do is try to speak to those kind of in the middle that are that can be influenced to do the right thing, and figure out what is it exactly that will make that particular company or segment of the industry move in a positive direction. And
you've been able to, you have some success stories where you've been able to see 180 degree shift.
I think it's always incremental. I'm not sure we can always say, like, I wish I had that power. I go in, they say there's not a problem, I leave, and they're like already, sketching out their reformulation. No, I think it's incremental.
Sure.
And it also depends on where you are in the supply chain too. So, I mean, it's not too surprising that the entities that whose sort of business profitability relies on the use of continued use of certain chemicals, mm-hmm. would like to continue to manufacture those chemicals, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, like retailers, they want to make their customers happy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
Can I respond in my world, in the legislative world? Oftentimes it's not the individual companies that are a problem. It's actually the trade associations that are the problem, because they want to keep the lowest common denominator, right? They want to make sure that the policies are the least impactful. And so that's been our biggest challenge, because those trade associations obviously are lobbying really, really hard. We go into Sacramento and we see them there. Every time I'm there, I see them there, and I know they're there when I leave, and I know they're there before I got there. So, I think for us, that's the biggest challenge, is really, the trade associations. I think the other challenge too is, unlike I think some of the industry leaders that are here today, it's getting industry to speak out. Getting those people who aren't, not so bad to actually say, no, this is important. We really need that change. And, getting them to Sacramento, getting them in, or DC, getting them to actually talk, to legislators. And I think as Martha said about the doctors, they carry a heavy weight, if you will. So do businesses. And so the more active businesses can be to influence the legislative process in a progressive way, we will see more change.
I actually am going to do a plug for a professor here, Dr. Peter Sinsheimer, who's been able to do, who looks at sort of how you do policy-driven change, both around dry cleaning and switching from dry cleaning to wet cleaning. And there you had a perfectly safe technology that we still couldn't get rid of perchloroethylene. But he also did something amazing with lead and pipes, right? And we worked on the bill, and the metal manufacturers, California metal manufacturers we were going to destroy them. It would be an end to the industry. Nobody could meet the standard for lead-free pipes. Well, I think the alternatives assessment was just completed, and well, guess what? You can, and you can make money, and the company's based in South LA. And that actually led us, and we're still sort of working on this idea of, so for a lot of the policymakers in some of the most impacted communities tend to always side with industry, right? Because they're low-income communities, their money comes from industry. And so how do we begin to talk about it from a community perspective, an economic development perspective, and so we're dealing with this technology gap and innovation gap. So we have policies like these green zones policies, right, that are land use zoning policies around co-location of facilities, but we can't fix it because we don't have the green technologies that will actually address auto body shops, metals manufacture, furniture manufacturing. So we're trying to figure that out, right? What's the partnership? We've talked to John Warner, we're talking to other folks, and we want to talk to a lot of the folks in this room about how do we green manufacturing in South LA? And how do we bring the scientists into those companies? And then I think electeds will listen. Right, because it's about bringing jobs back, it's about the things that they're talking about. And I just think we have to get better at that part.
I see on Slido a question from Meg W. Is this, could that be someone in the room?
I've taken a vow of silence until the reception.
Till their first glass of wine.
Let's do this live, perhaps.
So many clients call me up and they say, Meg, we want to pick up the challenge. We've seen these toxic videos. We want to get rid of toxics. We don't know where to start. How do we prioritize? So they always ask me, what are your favorite prioritization frameworks? And not to put anyone on the spot, but what lists are some of your favorite lists?
Oh, the list of chemicals?
So they want to know how to, not just the big framework is what are the steps that go through it, but what are some lists that businesses can access to begin to, so SVHCs, Prop 65, co-wrap.
Well, I mean, it's hard to choose. What's more important, cancer or reproductive toxicity? I mean, I would say rather than the chemical list, what I would like to challenge is, well, where are the communities that are most vulnerable and are having the most extreme health disparities? What can we do to help them, right? So some things we've been talking about working with Black Women for Wellness is like, how do we get healthy hair straighteners? How do we get, healthier nail products so that the people who are using them aren't, on a regular basis aren't being exposed, right? So what are the products that are in high use? I know this is product based, but at least from a product's perspective, what are the products that are in high use in vulnerable communities? And that could be either vulnerable, depending on how you define that community, right? It could be community of workers, it could be a local community. So I think that would be where we really want to really push and see progress, because in the end, we know that there are good products out there, but most of them are in Whole Foods. And so it's like those aren't where our communities are shopping. So and I get the supply chain issue and getting them down to cost, and that's going to take time, but until then, how can we start to prioritize the things that are in high use in vulnerable communities?
So TEDx list of potential endocrine disruptors is not a prioritization tool. But there are certainly tools that use information that's coming out of TEDx to, I assume, make priorities, or if not make priorities, then suggest alternatives. So you have like chemsex similarity in there. Some of their tools are good. And Healthy Building Network, I think it kind of depends on what the end use is. Like that's a good way to go about choosing which prioritization scheme.
And it's actually amazing. There's a wealth of data on prioritization, including from EPA, for example. And one of the biggest issues is how do you get that information out there into the general public? How do you get people to, one, access it easily, and then also understand what is being presented to them in a manner that they can actually use it in their everyday lives? So that's always kind of been a challenge. A lot of the information is already out there.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, could I? So, I love hate lists. So they're not. I kind of sort of see them as like a necessary good, not quite it's not a necessary evil. It's a necessary good. And in our experience with the business engagement work, it's often the sort of first step for a company because it feels manageable. It's sort of like we need to have our RSL, our restricted substances list, so that we can have a conversation with our suppliers and say none of this, because sometimes these companies don't have toxicologists on staff, and so it's the most clear-cut way to communicate what they don't want. That being said, to the point down there, it's not sufficient. I think it's sort of a first step, easy approach, but ultimately we want to be not only thinking about what we want to move away from and start thinking about what we want to move towards, but sometimes depending on where a company is in their journey in doing that, they're more or less equipped to be doing both in parallel. But I think as companies, hopefully more and more companies sort of fold this into their business model, it will be beyond just RSLs, and it will be talking about here are the criteria or the qualities that we want to see in what you are providing for us to manufacture our goods. And by the way, not just the actual good itself, but we're concerned about exposures that are happening across the whole supply chain that led to that ingredient. So Target also came out with a chemicals policy, and I was really impressed with it. They were talking about not only the exposures to the consumers, but the exposures to the workers that may occur through the synthesis of that ingredient, all the way getting down into the product, into the store. So we're seeing more enlightenment.
I think Tim has a question, and we actually will have another panel discussion after this one. We'll have a short break. We'll have another panel discussion, which will be solely focused on the future. So I have a lot more questions for you all that I think we should probably save for that second half. Tim, do you want to?
There's no break.
Oh, there's no?
No.
Okay.
I'm afraid nobody will come back from that break.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask a question about a different kind of prioritization. So Martha, particularly hearing what you were describing and Catherine talking about change, it's like the folks who are in your constituency seem to be under assault from multiple directions. Not only do they have to worry about their personal care products and their household products, they have to worry about the street they're living on, the soil, right? So there's all of these dimensions. So how do you, as organizations, prioritize what to focus on? And is it possible to address these things in an integrated fashion? Like, thinking about the whole, the social, economic, political system in which, and is that even possible to think about an integrated system level approach? Or is it, you have to fight in the trenches day to day and, put out the latest fire?
So we're trying. So that diagram was the first iteration of the model that we're trying to come up with. But we start with that model around organizing out the bad. So it is about building political power to actually change things. And there is sort of a prioritization and dealing with communities where they're at. But because we work with communities that are fighting refineries, that are fighting oil drilling, and then when we talk to them about cleaning products, they're like, oh shit, right? So, excuse me. And so you may live next, so they want both, right? So we're trying to develop this model that is based on the work we're doing in South LA, where we're talking about transforming South LA from the soul to the soil, where we're working with everyone from like trauma-informed care that's working with ex-offenders to folks who are trying to stop the school-to-prison pipeline. And when we talk to them about lead, they're like, oh my God, right? We should be, if we're dealing with kids in incarceration and what leads to that, one, we're going to deal with systemic racism. But you know what? If kids are coming to school lead poisoned, and they are, so that's going to be an issue. So we're trying to build political movement because we know that's what's going to work. But the solutions have to be community driven. So, you know, the work that Change is doing is like, well, let's find an alternative to these particular chemicals that are being used in nail salons or hair salons, which are a major source of economic development and entrepreneurship, right? So then the next question is, well, let's look at the decaying manufacturing base in South LA. That's furniture and metals and clothing. And so how do we start building alliances with them, either through workers or through the companies, right? And so, and that's kind of where we are. And I know I'm going to be reaching out to the clean production folks, and we want to do a green screen training for electeds in South LA, because they still see us as, you just want to ban stuff, right? And so now when we go in and have this conversation, they're like, you're an environmental health organization and you're talking about economic development, and you walk in with people from my district and they know you. And so it's changing the way we can have the conversation, but we're still in the very beginning. So it is about weaving all the movements together.
Well, thank you very much. So, we'll just clap for this panel. And then you stay there. What I'm going to awkwardly do is try to carry this off the stage in front of you all so that we have enough room to get all the speakers to actually come up to have the wrap-up panel discussion. I do CrossFit. I should be fine.
It's like everyone else. Okay, get cozy.
Don't fall off the stage.
Did you get yours? Okay.
Here we go.
Is that it?
Okay, don't fall off the stage.
Should we go?
Mike Jarrett in the back. No, actually, we want you to ask that question again. No?
That in many areas of public health, we see the solutions of today becoming the problems of tomorrow. And we could look at urban planning and the shift from industrial cities to suburban cities, or we could look at green chemistry and the regrettable replacement. So if you had to choose one thing that you could do to prevent the solutions of today becoming the problems of tomorrow, what would that be?
I'm actually going to say, follow the science, right? So if you look at dry cleaning, we came up with wet cleaning technology. If you look at the hazard traits of water and the biodegradable detergents, and then you look at the hazard traits of the green earth, and we left, so it was politics that gave us a bad decision, right? So we have green earth, that's the one that's taken over the market. It's got hydrocarbons, it's liver toxic, and you know what? We knew that before it got on the market, and we chose to ignore it. MTBE, we kind of knew its hazard traits and what might be the problem, but for political reasons, we ignored them. So I think it's always about the science and having enough power not to let sort of, I want my win, or whatever it is, right, that we cave.
So follow the science, anybody else?
I'll take a stab at that. This is my current agenda, which is we need to think about the post-petroleum economy for materials right now.
Yep.
We should have talked about it 10 years ago. We spent 20 years thinking about renewables for fuel, as we should have, but that's the toxics that we've all been working on for decades are all petroleum-based. So we've learned a lot. I would echo follow the science. Let's not make those same mistakes again. Let's not shift and look as broadly as we can so we don't make a shift from one environmental medium to another, from one health endpoint to another, from environment to workers. We know what the mistakes were. So this is sort of a decision analysis question. I'm punting to Tim here.
I want to give other people a chance to answer, but I also want to play devil's advocate. What happens if the science is equivocal?
That's what I was going to say. So I think Martha's completely correct, and the only thing the thing that I would add to that is generate the science. I mean, we have a small subset of chemicals that are data rich, and apparently sometimes that's not even enough to take action when we should. But taking out that small percentage of chemicals from the equation, for the vast majority of chemicals, as I sort of alluded to in the presentation, we either don't know very much about its exposures. There tend to be a lot of exposure data gaps, but we are also find ourselves in a position of not having much hazard information either. And so we need to figure out how we can get ourselves out of that hole in a meaningful way so that people that are in the positions of making decisions about chemicals are fully informed. And I know that there's been a lot of interest in thinking about how we can use new testing approaches to generate greater data faster so that we can sort of more expeditiously fill those data gaps with the provision that that data is meaningful. But yeah.
I have one too. I would say meaningful participatory assessment. So there's this whole literature on unintended consequences, and all of those examples folks have talked about could be traced back to not having in place an assessment process that involved everybody who was a stakeholder in a meaningful way. So it would be hard to do, right? Because we have that kind of thing, like with think NEPA, CEQA, we have those kinds of things, but you can see in CEQA, at least to some extent, it does force consideration and imagination of what might happen in decision making. So I would say if I had my wish, it would be meaningful, participatory assessment, technology assessment, land use assessment, whatever. Sorry.
So let me build on that and say I think what we really need to develop is a core for sustainability, which is a trade-off analysis. Sustainability is based upon economics, environment, and social issues, including health. How do you trade off among them? I mean, Kathy gave us a good reason to ditch plastics. Let's say somebody comes up with a better plastic that can absorb our weight in a car as we're sitting on the cushions. That's half but it's half the weight of the existing cushions. Well, you get better mileage out of that. We want to do that. It's great for global climate change, but let's say that it's slightly more endocrine disruptive, if you will, on some in vitro tests than the existing one. Well, that would be wonderful. That would solve the problem too. How do we trade off about that? We have to make decisions about global climate change and what does that mean. Versus the issue of endocrine disruptors and who's going to want to sit on that cushion. And I don't think we're prepared to do it. I think trade-off analysis has begun, but it's about where life cycle analysis was perhaps 15, 20 years ago. And I think a lot of the issues we talked about today, to avoid this regrets analysis afterwards, require us to do better trade-offs.
Thank you. Before we go too far into the answers, I actually wanted to poll one last time the room. So maybe you can go back to poll everywhere, and you have those bright lights shining onto you. Our very last question for you all online and here is, what do you think is the most significant barrier to removing potential toxic exposures from your lives? And we have A, B, C, D, F choices. So safer product is not as good as the original product. The question of brand loyalty, lack of sufficient information, safer product is more expensive, lack of motivation, or there's just no safer product that is available. So
Happy to text in people's responses on the panel.
C. Which one? Okay. C. Minus C. Okay. 2 C's. Which one?
I'm going to answer as well.
All of them. F.
F?
Yeah, that's okay. 2 F's? Okay. Thank you.
I was looking for the none of the above.
None of the above. Oh, he did. She did it for us. Yeah.
Oh, boy.
I put in F's. Maybe it only. Oh, it's telling me I can't vote more than one time.
Yeah.
So there's
You're being overzealous.
there are 3 F's
Waiting the vote count.
and 3 C's. No,
Someone
there are
never
3
missed a
F's
test
and
or
2
pop quiz.
C's not accounted for.
3 F's and 2 C's.
3 F's and 2 C's not accounted for.
Okay, so we're kind of hitting again on the point of lack of sufficient information, which we talked about, as well as that question of cost. So I think it might be a good idea to go back to these 2 points a little bit and talk about what not just in your own world, like your organizations can do, but what we can all do, like people in the general public. I guess, I don't know if I count as general public, but people in the general public can do themselves to try to tackle these 2 issues. Can we find products that are less expensive? Can we argue for those, and how would we do that? So I'd love to hear your take on that.
Start. In terms of safer products and cost, a lot of times in our salon work, we find that people do want safer products or safer alternatives, but they're just really expensive. But what we're seeing specifically in the Black community is that there's this huge push for like a huge natural hair movement, and so all of these companies are starting to kind of pop up. We call them kitchen chemists, so folks who are making products in their home and things like that, and actually growing substantially. And even when we go into Target, before there'd only be maybe 1 or 2 sort of natural hair products for Black women, but now there are whole shelves full. And so we see that consumers are really driving the market, and hoping that can continue when we talk about professional salon products.
I mean, one challenge, particularly in the beauty care industry, is that the trade associations such as the Personal Care Products Council and ICMAD, the Independent Cosmetic and Manufacturers Distributors Association distributors, who I get along with, they're very risk-based. They're trying to just follow the rules and not go any farther. So it's challenging then to push a precautionary principle hazard agenda with the current, how associations are currently set up. So it takes companies like Beauty Counter, for example. Honest has had some blips in the road, but they're trying to do the right thing to engage and push it, because those trade associations are really powerful. And until that changes, it's going to be hard to have more access to more information and data, and to push more of a precautionary principle approach in that industry in particular, because they are so powerful, those associations. But so are people, so.
I'd just like to add a wonderful acronym called Catnip. Have you heard of Catnip? It stands for the cheapest available technology not involving prosecution. Somehow we have to get industry beyond that. Now, some industry has, as we've heard. There are a lot of really good industries signing up to try to convince President Trump to do the right thing on Paris. But the trade associations absolutely are catnip oriented.
What's the P?
Prosecution. Oh, that's great.
Hello, professors. I'm a master student from food safety. So actually, I have a related question about this, since the answer is lack of sufficient information. So if that's for the public or for scientists, actually, I think there's a gap between the scientists and the public. So that's why we speak of like risk communication. So focus on this area, and I really want to ask some questions about like how to do risk communication to the public, and like what's the degree and how we can control these degree things. If you say, oh, the toxic is very like terrible things, and there may be cause like society panic or like, so that's So that's like the question like struggling me a lot.
How do scientists better communicate? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we give her a clap for asking?
You know, I actually think for the most part, scientists do we sort of take the science and translate it and then figure out how to go out into the community. So I actually, because I'm a health educator by training, and so I came up during both AIDS and the tobacco wars. So we were very careful, like, don't scare people, right? You can scare people in a 1-minute ad to call a phone number, right? And they would do that. But if you integrate the fear into your regular presentation, you immobilize folks. So there's a lot of theory within public health how to do that. We're not always really good at it because we take sort of science and regulatory science and then translate that into how we educate communities. And so we've had to really like stop doing that, because I would do presentations and people would be freaked out afterwards. And I'm like, that's not what I wanted to do, right? And so we did a thing like, what's in your purse, right? And we had people take out their beauty bags and we did searches on them, and we showed, how folks can follow the alternatives. But then we stopped doing that altogether and just focus on the alternative. Just focus on the green cleaning. And through the green cleaning training, people get a valuable skill. They really have fun. It's funny, we use aroma oils and everybody's in a really good mood, right? At the end of the day, and so at the end of the training, and I just talked to someone and they said, my members still talk about that training. And that training, Raquel and I did maybe 2.5 years ago. So it stuck. So and that's why we did the toxies, right? Because people would like, oh, you're the gloom and doom people, right? So flipping that, I think, is really fun and empowering ways.
Yeah, I just want to say always having some sort of solution to the problem. And so when you come out and you say, these are like really terrible, like having some sort of tangible steps that people can do. And then also access to the information. Like, as scientists, we publish in all these journals, right? But no one has access to that. Personally, I can be like, oh yeah, there are a bunch of journals that talk about miscarriages with cosmetologists. And people are like, oh, I don't have access to that information. And so we hold all of this information in these sort of journals and, not open access journals. And how do we give that information to health educators and promoters who can share that information in a way that people are actually engaged through toxes and popular education materials.
So I have two things, if I could. I'll try to be brief, Tim. So there are two things. There's one current and then one sort of developing approach. And I have the same experience of 20 years of terrifying people. And it gets kind of soul-killing after a while, so you focus on solutions. One of the things that Women's Voices for the Earth, for example, talks about is giving people 3 options for activity. One is how you reduce your own exposure, and then organizing with a lot of the organizations we've heard about today to support policy changes. And then the third is direct action against corporations. So that works for consumer-facing brands. And then several of us are part of a broader foundation-led group called the Cancer-Free Economy Network that's been around for 2 or 3 years now, and we're actually researching now how we shift the narrative. Because if you think about the narrative in public space generally, you hear disease is your own fault, it's your genetics, it's your we don't actually talk about chemical exposures at all. And how do we shift that? And then the solution is diet and exercise. It's still an individual responsibility issue. So we're researching why those images are so powerful, that narrative is so powerful, and how to shift that. So hopefully that'll come out in the next few months, and we'll see if we're a little more successful in translating, what can do about these bigger issues without terrifying people and paralyzing them, because that's the really scary. Then the response you get is also, everything's going to give me cancer, so why should I worry about my water bottle, my shampoo?
There's somebody in my family who, like maybe every month, I get an email from them. They send me something and say, "Did you know?" And it's like some ridiculous, inaccurate article they read, or a friend of them send them an email. So I think we also have to think about misinformation as well as information, and building capacity for people to distinguish between those two. That person, every time they sent me something, I would just send them back a link to Snopes and have them, okay, now put it in there and see if it's true or not. And right, so we need to, like, in our young, when kids are in elementary school all the way up through grad school, I think we have to think about ways to encourage, particularly today, how to distinguish good sources from not so good sources, and also to critically analyze sources that you get. And that's something that starts young and goes up.
Can I add something to this? So is your master's in the sciences, or is it in a sort of public health? Okay. So one thing that I think, everything that everybody said, I completely agree with. But I think to a point that was raised earlier today, communicating levels of risk can be very challenging. We have a way of doing that in the scientific community, and we have a way of doing that in the regulatory space, sometimes more effective or reasonable than other times. But it is difficult to communicate a reference dose or a reference concentration that's assigned to a chemical to an individual. And their question is, okay, so am I harmed? Is there a potential harm to me? And we, as I think scientists, want to be just accurate, which is, there's a 1 in 1,000 increased incidence to you of developing cancer if you're exposed to this chemical at this concentration over a course of 70 years. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that that's really challenging. So when you line up, 2,000 endocrine disrupting compounds, and they want to know, like, what if the question was posed, which of these to any of us worries you more than another? That's a different question, and it is challenging.
So then, what do you think about the app that was shown earlier in that sense? Then, because you're talking about the complexity of the information, and then we're saying, oh, all you need to do is use this app, and you'll know. Okay. But yeah, so then what can we do on the consumer end of things?
Man, I knew I held back from adding nuance. I think that those apps are useful. I mean, they all have different algorithms, which to Tim's point, we don't know specifically how they're making their decision cutoffs. Sometimes it may be binary, and that's the reality. Is this chemical present in the product or not? And regardless of the degree of toxicity that chemical poses, all chemicals are going to be judged equally. And I think there's arguments for that could be a good thing. And then other apps may take into account the concentration of a chemical in a formulation. But that's actually probably the rare than the norm, because that's proprietary information to the company. So it's very difficult for somebody who's in the space of developing these apps to even be able to get to that level, which is what's the concentration, because that's proprietary information. The suppliers don't provide that. I still think that there's meaningful. I think that there are some chemicals, for example, PBTs, that I don't care what level at which they're present. They're bad news, and we shouldn't be exposed to them. So it's probably not a satisfactory response, but it's a good question, and I think it's a difficult one, but I do think that those apps help customers make decisions when otherwise they don't have any tools. And I also think that the fact that these apps exist makes companies want to think about what they can do to improve their formulation.
Gets the ball rolling.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I was one of the early developers of the health screen on Good Guide, full disclosure. I could talk you through the methodology, but we'd be here for another week and a half. And I suspect it's changed since then, and it has been challenging. And we did try to do some adjustments around, if we had lists of occupational carcinogens, for example, we tried to figure whether they were relevant for consumers. And so there's a lot buried in that algorithm, and now I think the way Good Guide dealt with it is to put a filter in, so you can put in your own filters. So if you're particularly vulnerable to parabens or whatever, you can do a screen for that. I think it's an evolving space. But that, is predicated on, does your consumer know enough to know that it's parabens that they're reacting to, and is there enough information? And then we're all scientists up here, a lot of us, we all want more information. So it's an ongoing challenge. They're really hard to trade off. Yes, and it's still the highest in the histogram.
Sure, yeah.
So you two will be the last questions. So make them good.
Make them good.
No pressure.
kind of condense my question and statement. So I spent most of my life as in more clinical academic research. So speaking to the concerns or questions around why aren't more scientists speaking out or advocating for these changes responsibly or educating the public, and not from the public health space, but more of the academic kind of lab research space, where you're told, especially in the spaces around endocrine disruption, which is where I come from, you're not supposed to advocate too heavily because then you are classified as an activist, and that can actually affect your funding cycles, at least here in the States. I think that might be changing a bit. Not that funding cycles are getting better, but that, I think people are really starting to see the public health pressures of not speaking out more actively. I forgot my question. I had a question. Okay.
That was a great comment.
I'm going to
you
come
could stop
back.
there and it'd be great.
My question will come back.
Actually, this is a follow-on to that, so it's a good segue. So I wanted to ask our panel members, and I agree that it's a very slippery slope for scientists to become an advocate. And, oftentimes if I get asked to sit on a panel like the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee for the EPA, I have to sign something that says I haven't made public statements that would give a bias, or somebody would perceive that I had a bias one way or the other. And that's the case with a lot of the scientific advice we give. We're told to be unbiased and to follow our best scientific logic and knowledge. So what's the best thing that we as scientists can do, or that my center can do, to help you to better educate the public, or to help you to advocate in a way that we can't really do directly without damaging our credibility?
That's a really good question. It's one that all of us have been involved in the field for any length of time have wrestled with a lot. Slippery slope is true, but I believe in a sort of a situational ethics. I think if as scientists we know something that is about, the dam is about to break and nobody else knows it, we've got to go out there and advocate to do something about it. On the other hand, if you've got very effective organizations, of which lots of people sitting here represent, that will run with this information, then I think as scientists, we should keep our scientific distance, but make sure that the information is given to those who not only are effective in it, but they're more effective than we are in advocacy in general. But that's a situational approach, and every situation is going to be a little different, but that's the best I've come up with. I know as a dean of a school of public health, I have not wanted to recruit people who weren't willing to at least think of the implications of their science to the public and be willing to work with organizations that would make a difference. And it could be well with the trade industry as well. I mean, it's not necessarily always with environmental groups, but I think that's a criteria for being in public health. I don't think it's a criterion for being the chair of a department of molecular biology.
Good answer?
One thing I've got to say about working with an association like GC3, when we were involved in the plasticizer pilot program, there were a number of plasticizers where industry didn't agree with my conclusion that a substance was endocrine active. And I stayed impartial. I just evaluated the science, and then I was protected by GC3. So I've really tried to keep to the science and then let bigger organizations advocate so that I can be seen as an impartial scientist. And that worked fairly effectively. The company wasn't too happy still because the science got out that a certain plasticizer was endocrine active. But at the end of the day, consumers who are exposed to it, it's a big DEHP replacement, could read the science if they chose to and see that there were other safer plasticizers if they chose to use plastics that were plasticized. So thank goodness for some of the good associations out there.
But we didn't hear we heard from some scientists. Well, what about from the organizations? Can you give us, not me, I'm not a scientist, so I kind of felt left out, Mike, but can you give some guidance to researchers about how we can best help you, but still kind of maintain that?
We're trying to figure that out. Right now, I'm trying to find a scientist who will come testify to a city planning commission around the impacts of proximity to oil and gas. Right? And we have the demographer, we have the mapper, but we've had a harder time finding, you know, someone like on this panel that's a scientist to take that risk. And they're not, we don't want them to go beyond the science. We just have to say, this is what the science shows, and the closer you are, the greater the hazard and the risk of exposure, and that's all, right? But that's actually really challenging. And I think that at some point, we have to give scientists back their voice, right? And that they're, because I find a lot of fear, both from physicians and from scientists. And, you know, whether it's about threatening their science, their funding, I'm not sure what it is. But it is, it's a bit of a frustration.
So we do try to work with academic scientists where we can. One of the ways that we do that is we sometimes host calls, group calls with academic and government researchers where it's invitation only, and they can talk together about their research and kind of discuss in general what kind of research seems like it's going to be the most impactful or the most important in terms of addressing regulatory questions that might be coming up. And another thing which is pretty easy is trying to publicize new research in a more effective way. We collaborate with a lot of researchers who, in the process of submitting their papers to journals, don't realize that they can control the publication date. And so the paper will come online and suddenly press is not going to be interested in it anymore because it's already public and there's not time for them to do the research and put together a good article. And so just by knowing as a researcher that you can specify the publication date, that there are resources available. I mean, at university press offices, there's also a nonprofit called the Science Communication Network, and we try to help as well, who can help come up with an accessible press release and give you some resources for better communicating your research results without in any way biasing what you've done or putting a slant on it that can really make a big impact.
And I think in terms of sort of science communication and folks really wanting to be able to communicate their messages, UCLA has been holding a ton of different events for particularly graduate students who, I think after the election and some other things, have been really, really interested in how they as scientists can really get the message out. There's like a new science policy graduate group. The Career Center does a whole bunch of events of just like how to run a blog, how to be active on Twitter as a scientist. And there's actually a really cool Twitter page where they have guest scientists like every week, and you can tweet about your work and really engage with a large audience and really get the information out there. And I think I'd like to say less people, I don't know, personally I'm a scientist and I'm an advocate. I see myself as both, and I don't think, I think we can blend that, and I think that's okay. And I see that a lot of younger scientists are seeing that as well. So.
Yes, I am particularly moved by presentation given by Ms. Arguello, and I want to acknowledge your 30 years plus of fighting for the better cause. And in this context, I humbly also want to suggest I am a finalist in a $150 million acquisition of land in Woodland Hills, and the reason that I'm going for it is because it has very not only financial, but it's the last holy land of the space industry, very much polluted, and where the Apollo Space Factory used to be, and I want to build California Space Center dedicated to space science, space entertainment. Now, because there are massive economic interests, there is a budget for the scientists to be paid, you know, few $1,000 or whatever the fee is to come and share the expertise. So I am humbly saying that corporations who, you know, collaborate with me and others are known to provide money for the scientists as a part of the package in negotiations. And I would be very happy to see if some of the pull and plug and everything that I have could be used to support your cause, which is really beautiful, and I empathize with. And we have to ask those who have money, spend money for all the wrong reasons, and sometimes for good ones, to pay up for the privilege of sitting at the table with people like you.
Oh, thank you. I like that, yes. And we'll talk when we're done. And, you know, we've been working for 30 years. It's actually how our local chapter got started because of Boeing and the partial nuclear meltdown that happened in the Santa Susana Mountains.
Santa Susana, I am talking about to take it over because
Then we couldn't take your money because we can't take Boeing money. Well, we should talk.
But all those places are polluted, but to some extent, and there's a big fight. Are they polluted badly or are they polluted so?
Well, yeah, clean it up.
Bernie, you have.
Yeah, I wanted, just as a follow-up on the last way I answered, I want to make sure everybody hears and understands that there are two bills that have passed the House of Representatives. One to change the EPA scientific advisory advice. The other is the so-called HONEST Act, which is will basically get rid of the research that's being done to support EPA. They both come out of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, headed by a bunch of climate deniers. It is really bad stuff. They've artfully disguised it. They've got it through the Congress. It will end EPA's scientific advisory function, period, as well as the research that EPA funds. So I would make sure that you're alert to that, because if it passes the Senate, there's no question it will be signed by the President.
Yeah, it's quite elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, which is what you just mentioned, which is going to play a havoc.
Well, if I could jump in and ask a question also, which is related to the HONEST Act and some other things. It's something I've been thinking about throughout the day, this information thing, but how do we build trust across these lines? We have, a really great panel representing, high toxicologists like Dr. Goldstein, who can tell us the mechanisms of action for every chemical out there. And we've got the people who are translating that science on the front lines and getting political wins. And when I go out and I talk to people, my Lyft driver or somebody just at a restaurant or a bar, there's a very big distrust of government and science. And, we've seen the fake news. And so what can we do as the people there's diverse audiences watching right now. How can we rebuild trust across these lines to protect health?
I'll take part of that because it's something I've been thinking about as well. On the science, that's trust in government and then trust in science. So I'll answer the trust in science and maybe I'll think about something brilliant for trust in government. But I think that to the general public, right, to the lay people, sort of like not to embrace science, to understand the opportunities that come with science, right, that it's not bad or a lie or, just another opinion out there, right? My first big realization when I got to DC. So one thing I think that would be helpful is to actually communicate with people like what amazing things have been learned and accomplished through science. And I don't think that people really think about that, like getting the rover onto Mars, just the amazing amount of science that was behind that and how cool it was that the United States was the first to, to accomplish something like that. Or somebody told me yesterday, like maybe, or make it somewhat entertaining. So somebody threw out this idea the other day to me, sort of like, let's talk about the chemistry that's used in the hair product on Donald Trump's hair, so it so that it's engaging, it's entertaining. And then, that can be the entree to like the parts of science that are really cool, and I think that that can be an entree to then having conversations about the other things that science does, which is shed truth and light on problems. And I think that people tend to think mostly in that camp and not in the camp about, how science has actually led to breakthroughs in biomedical research that we're all benefiting from today. So that would be my thoughts on the science piece.
If I can say one thing about this, I was fortunate enough to receive some training on this. Not that I've had the opportunity to use it extensively, but the Burroughs Wellcome offered this science communication, especially in the face of distrust. And what I thought was really illuminating to me was the fact that I have this tendency as a scientist to just throw facts at people's faces, which never works. But I can't believe that it doesn't work. I can't convince myself that that's not the best way to go about it, and yet it apparently really is not. And then I was shown scientific studies that showed that, and then I had to believe that. Yes. And then instead was this idea of, no, establish common ground first. Establish that your values are actually indeed very, very similar. Start there, and then slowly integrate your perspective on this. And I mean, this is going to be a little bit of a personal story, but I tried that with one of my Airbnb tenant. I was not allowed to in West Hollywood, but I did anyway. Who did not believe in vaccination, and I just came out of that training, and I decided to try it. And I don't think she went about the next day and vaccinated her children, but we had a very pleasant conversation, and I felt at least we were. There was no level, there was not me throwing things at her. It was just, tell me more about your children. Oh, I also care about people. I don't have children, but I care a lot about public health. And let's talk about what we really care about and establish that connection first. And I thought we were really having a conversation, and I really enjoyed that personally.
I was going to respond to the government piece. How do you trust your government again? You have to engage. You can't trust blindly. And that's one thing that has helped me too, is like, you have to know who your representatives are. You have to follow them. You have to keep them accountable. And, there are good folks out there in government, but you don't know if you don't engage. First off, and just because somebody gets into office because they have a good platform doesn't mean that they hold true to that platform. So I say that you have to engage. Yeah.
And a very quick addition, what we are doing, when the people go and experience things in massive amounts in the shopping malls. So we are taking the initiative forward and then using the teaser, the communication tools that really attract, like virtual reality, like also participation celebrities, and get them where they are. And why shopping mall now? Because my space that is still being built won't be ready for a while. So we want to put placements where people like you, hopefully like us, can go and influence those who are spending time unwisely. And we are looking at Topanga Westfield Mall, and I had a very good discussion with the Taubman family who owns Beverly Hills Mall. So, those are kind of Mission Impossible war attacks, because if we do that now, we can indoctrinate million people in 2 years and show them the science, show them Madame Curie, show them, the toxicology, show them space.
Science camp every time you go shopping.
Yeah.
Do it.
That's where we Americans spend our time shopping.
One of the issues, Tim, Tim, you pointed out about the importance of primary and secondary prevention. We've done a very, very poor job in public health of making it clear what science means to primary prevention, and particularly in relation to environmental health. And that's because we just don't know how to quantify that. It's much easier to, risk assessment is secondary prevention. The chemicals are already out there. Now we're going to figure out whether they're hazardous and their exposure, but that's secondary prevention. Primary prevention is the chemicals never get out there in the first place. There are lots of chemicals that never got out there in the first place. We don't know how many fish weren't killed, how many people, and we need to do a better job of at least explaining that and doing our best to estimate it, even though it's for something that's, well, it's just a back of the paper estimate. It's not something that's out there that people want to care about. So if we could do that, maybe we can sell science a little better.
My last comment.
No, anybody.
No, you're going to have the last comment.
Just to the point of building trust as a scientist is that people don't like to feel stupid. A lot of times we throw science at people and we say these big words and, you know, like, you didn't know that? You didn't know that was bad? And just people kind of build a wall when you do that, and thinking about how we can be just genuine communicators and just genuinely providing information to people without making them feel small or stupid or belittling them, which is, I think, something that science really needs to work on moving forward. So that's my comment.
Stay where you are. Stay where you are, because first, we're about to get to our reception. But before we do it, we want to give you all a big thank you for making this really just so interactive. And this panel was just so much fun to hear you guys talking. So can we have some, let's give them our thanks for a great day. We got to say thanks. This morning, Christina said thanks to our sponsors, and we don't want to forget them, but you heard their names already. The names I want to tell you now are all the folks who are kind of behind the scenes making everything happy, and we want to give a thanks and a call out to each of them. Some of them aren't even here. Nancy Arroyo, who took care of food and travel and got everybody here, and they look pretty good, so I think she did a good job. Kim Berger and Zian Liu, who did all this presentation stuff for us and kept it going seamlessly despite our best efforts to mess it up when we were up on the stage. Sydney Trung, is Sydney back out? Sydney, just all-around support. She did a fantastic job making things roll. Talia Bernhardt, who's out there. Is she in here now? Here she is now, but she had to stay out there the whole time, so she missed a lot of it. But she did sneak in to see some. The COEH Student Project awardees, who hopefully you got a chance to see what they had done. And of course, EHS, the Environmental Health Sciences, the EPI Department, the Environmental Science and Engineering doctoral program at the Institute of the Environment, all those students and all the other students who came here today. We want to thank them. We want to thank you, the audience that's here. And where's the camera? And you, the audience that's out there somewhere, we thank you all. But Patrick and I we have to say there's somebody here who we have to thank, who made this whole thing come together, starting on it like months ago. And not only did this person bring kind of the administrative and the support to make it happen, but also the substantive, where she would kind of keep us under control. Which is hard. Him. I'm a sweetheart. But and she just did Christina Variotti just did a fantastic job just making this and our other one happen. Christina's a graduate student, a doctoral candidate in the School of Public Health, and I've had the opportunity to work with her for many, many years now, and I'm much the better for it. And we just wanted to get her a little something. So what we have here are some personal care products. There's no shampoo in here. Oh, you can take any of those you want, except this one. That's my daughter's. There's no shampoo in here because my daughter advised me you never buy somebody shampoo. They need to buy that themselves. But some other ones that have been checked out on all of the apps that we have, and I still don't know if they're good. We got a bottle here that's made of glass, right?
Panel approved.
And here's some pixie tangerines grown in Ojai, California.
Without frack water?
Without frack water, and tended by angels and unicorns. Yeah, we did the best we could. I don't know what's on those, so wash them before you eat them. But anyway, thank you, Christina, for making this all happen.
And I have to throw the gratitude back to these guys who came up with the list of panelists to make this day as complete and holistic as it was. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Don't jump. All right, everybody, outside for some celebration, please. Thank you so much.